The most expensive mistake is usually the one everyone is applauding. Ethan Caldwell had built a fortune by making decisions faster than anyone else in the room. Yet on a brilliant October afternoon in Midtown Manhattan, his hand stopped less than an inch above a signature that would have changed everything. Sunlight streamed through the towering glass walls of the Grand Lexington Hotel's Executive Conference Center, casting long reflections across a polished walnut table where 12 executives, 6 attorneys, and 2 investment advisors sat in perfect confidence. Every leather portfolio had been carefully arranged. Crystal water glasses sparkled beneath recessed lighting. Fresh coffee filled the room with its rich aroma while television crews waited outside the closed doors, eager to report what financial analysts were already calling the merger of the decade. Billions of dollars, thousands of employees, and the future of 2 major corporations rested inside a stack of documents no thicker than 2 inches. Every schedule had been coordinated down to the minute. Every legal review had supposedly been completed. Every person present believed the difficult work was over. Ethan adjusted the sleeve of his charcoal suit and rested his father's black fountain pen against the final page. The pen was more than a writing instrument. It was the same pen his father had carried during the first business loan that transformed a small family company into something far greater. Ethan never signed an important agreement without it. Across the table, Victor Harlan, the polished chief executive of Northbridge Technologies, offered a relaxed smile that seemed perfectly appropriate for a celebration. Attorneys exchanged quiet nods. Assistants prepared electronic copies for immediate distribution. Everything looked exactly the way success was supposed to look. Almost exactly. Ethan lowered the pen another fraction of an inch before a soft voice interrupted the silence without raising itself above an ordinary conversation. "Do not sign here." The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they seemed to stop time itself. Ethan froze instantly. The fountain pen remained suspended above the signature line without touching the paper. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the faint hum of the building's climate control seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those 4 unexpected words. Ethan slowly turned his head. Standing beside him with a silver coffee pot still resting gently in one hand was Claire Bennett, a 27-year-old waitress whose white shirt and neatly pressed black apron made her almost invisible moments earlier. She did not appear frightened. She did not appear dramatic. Her expression remained calm, respectful, and completely certain. Around the conference table, puzzled faces turned from Ethan to Claire and back again. One attorney blinked in disbelief. Another quietly frowned. Victor's pleasant smile remained in place, but for the briefest moment something uncertain flickered behind his eyes before disappearing. Nobody understood why a hotel waitress would interrupt a billion-dollar signing. Nobody understood why one of the most disciplined executives in America had immediately stopped listening to everyone else in the room because of her. Ethan studied Claire for several silent seconds. She offered no explanation. She simply met his eyes with quiet confidence before lowering hers respectfully, as though she had already accepted whatever consequence might follow. The fountain pen remained perfectly still above the untouched page. Outside the conference room, photographers waited for doors that refused to open. Investors refreshed market updates on their telephones, unaware that history had paused behind polished wood and glass. Inside the room, every executive expected Ethan to dismiss the interruption, sign the agreement, and continue exactly as planned. Instead, he gently placed the fountain pen across the contract without writing a single letter. The unexpected movement echoed through the silence more loudly than any speech could have. "Why?" Ethan finally asked. Claire inhaled slowly before answering with remarkable composure. "Because something on that page does not belong there." No accusation, no panic, no explanation beyond those simple words. The room seemed to tighten around them. Attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. Victor folded his hands together with practiced patience. Someone quietly cleared a throat near the far end of the table. Yet no one dared rush Ethan anymore. The billionaire looked back at the unsigned agreement, then once again at the waitress standing beside him. For the first time in years, he ignored the pressure of schedules, headlines, and expectations. Instead, he listened to the only person in the room who had absolutely nothing to gain by speaking. 40 minutes earlier, the Grand Lexington Hotel moved with the quiet precision of a place accustomed to hosting people whose decisions shaped industries. Bell attendants welcomed guests through revolving glass doors while the scent of fresh coffee drifted across the marble lobby. Sunlight poured through enormous windows, painting warm reflections across polished stone floors as business leaders exchanged measured handshakes beneath crystal chandeliers. Claire Bennett guided a silver service cart toward the executive elevators with practiced confidence. Every porcelain cup had been aligned perfectly. Every linen napkin had been folded by hand. She had completed the same routine hundreds of times, yet she never allowed familiarity to replace attention. Details mattered. Small details mattered even more. At 27 years old, Claire had learned that the world often rewarded speed, while quietly, depending on those who still noticed what everyone else ignored. Most hotel guests remembered neither her face nor her name. She preferred it that way. Invisible people heard conversations others never noticed. They observed expressions that disappeared within seconds. They recognized tension hidden beneath polished smiles. As the elevator climbed toward the executive conference floor, Claire glanced at the day's event schedule displayed beside the control panel. The largest ballroom had been reserved for a charity luncheon. 2 conference suites hosted investment meetings. Executive conference room A carried only one simple description: private corporate signing. She thought nothing more about it. Meetings happened every day inside the hotel. Wealthy people arrived. Agreements were signed. Celebrations followed. Her responsibility never extended beyond serving coffee with professionalism and courtesy. When the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by a hallway unusually crowded with assistants carrying leather portfolios, technology specialists checking presentation equipment, and security personnel speaking quietly into communication earpieces. Everyone seemed focused on a single destination. Claire carefully guided the serving cart through the activity without interrupting anyone. Near the conference room entrance, 2 junior assistants stood reviewing printed schedules. As Claire approached, one of them lowered his voice almost instinctively. "He always signs after reading only the summary," he whispered. The other answered with a nervous smile. "That is why today has to stay on schedule." They immediately stopped speaking when they noticed Claire passing nearby. She acknowledged them with a polite smile and continued walking without changing her pace. The conversation lingered briefly in her thoughts before disappearing beneath the rhythm of her work. Inside executive conference room A, staff members completed the final preparations. Fresh flowers decorated a side table. Bottled water reflected the afternoon sunlight. Expensive leather chairs surrounded a magnificent walnut conference table stretching nearly 20 feet across the room. Everything communicated confidence, success, and absolute control. Claire quietly arranged coffee cups beside each place setting, making certain every handle faced the same direction. She believed people deserved careful work regardless of whether they noticed it. While placing the final cup near the head of the table, she noticed a familiar object resting beside the empty chair reserved for the principal guest. A classic black fountain pen inside a worn leather case. Unlike everything else in the room, it showed gentle signs of age. The leather edges had softened over time. Someone clearly valued it for reasons beyond appearance. Claire smiled faintly before returning to her serving cart. Objects often revealed more about people than expensive clothing ever could. Minutes later, executives began entering the room one by one. Expensive suits, confident voices, and carefully measured greetings filled the air. Ethan Caldwell arrived without unnecessary attention. He greeted every attorney by name, thanked the hotel manager for the accommodations, and quietly placed the old fountain pen beside the contract waiting before him. Claire noticed that despite his reputation as one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs, he listened more than he spoke. Across the table, Victor Harlan entered with the polished ease of someone completely certain the afternoon would unfold exactly as planned. The introductions were warm. The smiles appeared genuine. Yet as Claire poured the first round of coffee, she noticed something almost impossible to explain. Everyone seemed to be watching Ethan. Almost no one seemed interested in the agreement itself. Claire Bennett had learned long ago that the busiest rooms often hid the quietest warnings. She moved gracefully around the conference table, refilling coffee cups with steady hands while conversations flowed above billion-dollar projections, market forecasts, and carefully polished optimism. Nobody noticed the waitress. Nobody expected to. That invisible role had become one of her greatest teachers. Invisible people could watch without interrupting. They could listen without becoming part of the discussion. Claire poured fresh coffee beside Victor Harlan before continuing toward Ethan Caldwell. As she stepped between the chairs, a stack of contract pages shifted slightly when one attorney reached for a tablet. The movement lasted only a second, but it exposed part of the agreement that had been hidden beneath another folder. Claire's eyes caught several lines before the page settled back into place. She did not intentionally read the document. She simply noticed something that immediately felt familiar. It was not a sentence. It was not a company name. It was the structure of the language itself. One paragraph pointed toward another section buried elsewhere in the agreement. Another reference directed the reader to an appendix several pages later. Most people would never pause over such ordinary legal formatting. Claire did. Years earlier, she had watched her father spend countless evenings studying contracts after losing the small manufacturing company he had spent decades building. He had once explained to her that dangerous agreements rarely announced themselves in bold letters. They quietly connected harmless-looking paragraphs until the true meaning appeared only after every reference had been followed. The memory returned with surprising clarity as Claire gently placed Ethan's coffee beside him. She remained completely professional, never allowing the concern growing inside her to appear on her face. Ethan thanked her politely, without looking away from the executive summary resting before him. Across the room, Victor answered another question from one of the attorneys with relaxed confidence. Everything sounded ordinary. Everything looked ordinary. Yet Claire could not ignore the uncomfortable feeling that settled deeper each time she replayed the wording she had just glimpsed. She slowly returned to the serving card and organized the remaining cups simply to give herself another reason to stay inside the room. The discussion continued. Financial projections appeared on the presentation screen. Board approvals were confirmed. Timelines were reviewed. Every speaker emphasized efficiency, momentum, and moving forward without unnecessary delay. Claire noticed something subtle that made her even more uneasy. Nobody discussed the actual contract anymore. They discussed the celebration that would follow after the signatures. They discussed press conferences, investor reactions, and future expansion. The agreement itself had almost disappeared from the conversation. Ethan listened carefully to every presentation while occasionally making notes beside the executive summary. His reputation had been built on disciplined decision-making, but even disciplined people sometimes depended on trusted experts to examine details beyond their own field. Claire understood that. She also understood something her father had repeated for years. Trust was valuable. Verification was priceless. As another attorney summarized the final legal review, Claire quietly remembered the last conversation she had shared with her father before he passed away. He had smiled gently despite everything he had lost and told her, "Never be embarrassed to ask someone to read one more page. Pride has never corrected a signature." She had carried those words with her ever since. Ethan finally closed the executive summary and reached toward the old fountain pen resting inside its leather case. The room gradually became quieter. Assistants straightened their jackets. Tablets were lowered onto the table. Even the attorneys leaned back with satisfied expressions as though the difficult work had already ended. Claire watched Ethan remove the pen with deliberate care. He uncapped it slowly and positioned the final page directly before him. Through the conference room windows, Manhattan stretched beneath a bright autumn sky, while photographers gathered outside the closed doors waiting for history to unfold. Claire looked once more toward the contract. She looked toward Ethan. Then she noticed one final detail that made every doubt disappear. The page awaiting his signature carried a small reference number that did not match the paragraph she had glimpsed only minutes earlier. Someone had changed more than wording. Someone had changed the path leading to it. Claire Bennett remained beside the polished service card, her hands resting lightly against its silver handle while the conference room settled into the confident silence that always came before an important signature. Nobody appeared concerned. Every executive wore the relaxed expression of someone who believed every difficult question had already been answered. Ethan Caldwell uncapped his father's fountain pen with deliberate care, positioning it above the final page while the afternoon sunlight reflected across the glossy surface of the walnut table. Claire's eyes returned once more to the small reference number printed beside the signature block. The sequence did not belong there. She could not explain why with legal certainty, but every instinct told her the page had been connected to a different section than the one she had glimpsed only moments before. It reminded her of evenings spent beside her father at their kitchen table in Ohio, where stacks of contracts covered every available surface. He had never taught her law. Instead, he had taught her patience. He would follow one reference after another with a yellow pencil until an ordinary sentence suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Never trust a paragraph by itself, he often said. Trust the path it leads you down. Claire quietly repeated those words in her mind, while Ethan lowered the pen another fraction of an inch. Around the table, attorneys exchanged satisfied smiles. One assistant reached discreetly toward the conference room door, prepared to welcome reporters the moment the signatures were complete. Victor Harlan folded his hands comfortably in front of him, projecting absolute confidence. Everything suggested the meeting had already reached its conclusion. Claire looked around the room one final time, hoping someone else would notice what she had seen. Nobody did. Everyone watched the pen. Nobody watched the paper. That realization settled heavily inside her. She understood the risk of speaking. A waitress interrupting a billion-dollar corporate signing would almost certainly lose her job. She had no evidence anyone could immediately verify. She possessed only experience, observation, and an uneasy certainty that something important deserved another look. Ethan's hand continued its steady movement toward the signature line. Claire felt time narrowing into a single irreversible moment. She quietly stepped forward with the coffee pot, giving herself one final reason to stand beside Ethan without drawing attention. As she gently refreshed his cup, she leaned only slightly closer and spoke softly enough that only he could hear. "Do not sign here." The words disappeared almost as quickly as they were spoken, yet their effect was immediate. Ethan stopped. The fountain pen froze less than an inch above the paper. The movement was so sudden that several executives instinctively looked toward him before realizing nothing had happened except complete stillness. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward Claire. She met his gaze without defiance and without fear. Her expression remained calm, respectful, and remarkably steady. She offered no dramatic explanation, no accusation, only quiet conviction. Victor Harlan smiled politely, though the confidence behind the expression appeared slightly less effortless than before. One attorney cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. Another glanced toward the untouched contract, then back toward Ethan, uncertain whether to speak. The silence inside the conference room became almost tangible. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan continued moving at its ordinary pace while cameras and reporters waited patiently beyond the closed doors, unaware that history had quietly paused. Ethan finally rested the fountain pen across the document instead of signing his name. He looked at Claire for another long moment before speaking in a calm voice that carried easily across the room. "Why would you say that?" Claire inhaled slowly, choosing each word with care. "Because something on this page feels different from the way the rest of the agreement is written." She lowered her eyes respectfully before continuing. "I could be mistaken. I only believe it deserves one more careful reading." No one spoke. For the first time that afternoon, the pressure of schedules, headlines, and expectations gave way to something far more powerful. Doubt had entered the room, carried not by the wealthiest executive, nor by the most experienced attorney, but by the quietest person standing beside the table. No one moved. The silence inside the conference room seemed to stretch across every polished surface until even the quiet ticking of a designer wall clock became impossible to ignore. Ethan Caldwell kept his father's fountain pen resting across the unsigned agreement while his eyes remained fixed on Claire Bennett. She did not attempt to defend herself. She did not repeat her warning. She simply stood beside the silver coffee cart with calm composure, accepting that she had already said everything that mattered. Victor Harlan was the first to break the silence. His smile returned, polished and effortless. "Mr. Caldwell, I am certain the young lady means well, but we have spent months preparing this transaction. Every page has been reviewed by experienced legal teams from both companies." Several executives nodded in quiet agreement. One attorney leaned forward and added, "This version reflects the final approved draft delivered late yesterday evening. We are completely comfortable moving ahead." Ethan listened without interrupting. He had heard confident presentations his entire career. Confidence alone had never persuaded him. He lowered his gaze to the final page once more before calmly asking, "Would someone please show me the section this reference number points to?" The request sounded simple, yet several attorneys exchanged brief, uncertain glances before opening their binders. One lawyer quickly located the cited section, while another searched the electronic version on a tablet. Claire quietly stepped back toward the wall, hoping her involvement had ended. She never intended to become the center of anyone's attention. She only wanted one more careful look before a permanent decision was made. Ethan accepted the printed binder and slowly followed the reference with his finger. One paragraph led to another. That paragraph pointed toward an appendix. The appendix redirected him again. He continued reading without speaking. Around the table, the earlier confidence gradually gave way to curiosity. Victor remained composed, although his fingers briefly adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket before returning to the tabletop. Ethan reached the final reference section and paused. He quietly reread the paragraph from the beginning. Then he returned to the previous page and followed the references once again. His expression did not change, but the room sensed that something had. "Counsel," Ethan said calmly, "this wording is different from what I remember reviewing last week." His chief legal officer immediately leaned closer. "May I?" Ethan slid the binder across the table. The attorney examined both sections carefully before opening another folder containing an earlier draft. Within seconds, his forehead tightened. "The reference numbers have changed." Another attorney quickly joined him. "That cannot be correct." They compared both versions side by side, while the remaining executives watched in complete silence. The earlier draft directed readers to a routine governance clause requiring unanimous approval before temporary authority could be exercised. The current version pointed somewhere else entirely. The language appeared ordinary at first glance, yet it connected to provisions expanding temporary executive authority under specific operational conditions. Ethan rested both hands on the table. Who authorized this revision? No one answered immediately. Victor finally spoke with measured confidence. "It may simply be the result of a formatting adjustment during final document consolidation." Ethan looked directly at him. "Formatting changes do not redirect legal authority." Once again, the room fell silent. Ethan's chief legal officer opened his laptop and requested the document revision history from the firm's secure server. Another attorney contacted the Information Technology Department to retrieve the official audit log. Nobody objected. Nobody argued that the review was unnecessary anymore. Claire watched quietly as professionals who had entered the room completely certain now examined every page with renewed attention. She recognized the familiar pattern. Her father had once told her that the most dangerous mistakes were rarely caused by ignorance. They happened when experienced people stopped believing another review was necessary. Several minutes later, the chief legal officer looked up from his screen. His expression had changed completely. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully, "there were edits made after the final legal approval meeting. I believe we need to suspend the signing until we understand exactly what changed." Ethan slowly closed the agreement and placed his father's fountain pen back inside its worn leather case. Then he looked across the room toward Claire. For the first time that afternoon, he no longer saw a waitress serving coffee. He saw the only person who had asked him to read one more page before making the most important signature of the day. The atmosphere inside Executive Conference Room had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, the room had carried the quiet confidence of a carefully rehearsed celebration. Now every polished surface reflected uncertainty instead. Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside the walnut conference table with his father's fountain pen safely returned to its worn leather case. He looked neither frustrated nor angry. Instead, he appeared deeply focused, as though every conversation around him had faded into the background while only the facts continued to matter. Claire Bennett quietly rested both hands on the silver service card, wishing she could once again become invisible. She had never imagined that one whispered sentence would redirect the attention of an entire room filled with executives and attorneys. Ethan's chief legal officer connected his laptop to the large presentation screen mounted at the front of the conference room. Within moments, the document management system displayed a detailed revision history showing timestamps, user accounts, and every recorded modification made to the agreement. The attorneys moved closer together, comparing printed drafts with the electronic records while assistants silently distributed additional copies. Nobody spoke unless necessary. The only sounds came from turning pages and quiet keyboard clicks. Ethan folded his arms and watched patiently. "Walk me through every change made after the final approval meeting," he said calmly. His chief legal officer nodded. "Yes, sir." One attorney highlighted the approved draft from the previous week, while another opened the version resting on the conference table. Line by line, they compared both documents. Most revisions involved formatting, page numbers, and punctuation. Then they reached the governance section. The attorney stopped speaking. His expression changed almost immediately. "This reference number was modified," he said quietly. Another lawyer leaned closer to the screen. "Show the revision log." The audit history expanded, revealing that the cross-reference had been changed less than 12 hours earlier using an administrative account. Ethan remained completely still. Was that modification approved? The attorney searched through the authorization records before slowly shaking his head. "I cannot find any approval attached to this revision." Another member of the legal team opened the archive draft. The original reference directed readers to Section 38. The final version points to Section 42. Ethan looked toward the printed agreement. "Read both." The room listened carefully as the attorney read the original language first. It described a routine governance review requiring unanimous board approval before temporary executive authority could be transferred. Then he read the revised section. The wording sounded equally professional, yet its legal effect was significantly different. Under broadly defined operational circumstances, temporary decision-making authority could shift to a joint oversight committee immediately after closing, long before the full board completed its review. Ethan quietly asked, "Who appoints the initial members of that committee?" The attorney turned another page. "Both merging companies." Ethan nodded once, meaning influence changes before oversight begins. No one disagreed. Victor Harlan finally spoke after several long moments of silence. "There must have been an administrative mistake during document consolidation. We can correct it immediately." Ethan looked directly at him without raising his voice. "Perhaps, but we will determine exactly how it happened before anyone signs anything." Claire listened from across the room while memories of her father quietly returned. She remembered him sitting beneath a kitchen light late at night, tracing one reference after another with a yellow pencil until his shoulders slowly fell. He had once told her that contracts rarely betrayed people with obvious words. They betrayed them with overlooked connections. Watching the attorneys follow those same connections now felt strangely familiar. Ethan's information technology specialist entered the conference room carrying a secured tablet containing the complete server audit. He handed it to the chief legal officer without speaking. After reviewing the records, the attorney slowly looked up. The revised document was uploaded after the legal review officially concluded. The previous approved version was archived 12 minutes earlier. Another attorney quietly added, "The system shows only one document changed during that session." Every person around the table understood what that meant. The room fell silent once more. Ethan closed the agreement carefully and placed his hand on the leather case containing his father's pen. Then he looked toward Claire. She still wore the same white shirt and black apron. She still stood beside the coffee cart exactly as she had when the meeting began. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the way everyone else saw her had become completely different. The conference room remained remarkably quiet as every attorney continued reviewing the electronic records now displayed across the large presentation screen. No one seemed interested in the untouched coffee anymore. No one glanced toward the photographers still waiting outside the closed doors. The agreement that had been expected to make headlines before the closing bell had become secondary to a far more important question. How had a single legal reference changed without authorization? Ethan Caldwell slowly walked toward the display, studying the audit history line by line. Years of leading successful companies had taught him that important answers rarely arrived through assumptions. They arrived through patient observation. He turned toward his chief legal officer. "Can we identify the account that uploaded the final revision?" The attorney nodded while opening another secure report. "Yes, the modification came from an administrative account assigned to document management." Ethan remained calm. "Who had access?" "Several senior legal coordinators from both organizations," the attorney answered. "However, Only one login session remained active after the final review meeting officially ended. Another attorney quietly added, the archived version approved by both legal teams was replaced 12 minutes later. Victor Harlan folded his hands together and maintained a measured expression. Then we should determine which administrator made the change. There is no reason to assume intent before we have complete information. Ethan acknowledged the point with a slight nod. Agreed. Facts first. Claire Bennett listened without speaking. She stood beside the silver service cart exactly where she had been throughout the meeting, wishing she could simply return to serving coffee. Instead, every person in the room seemed aware of her presence now. She found the attention uncomfortable. She had never wanted recognition. She only wanted one important document to receive one more careful reading. Ethan suddenly turned toward her. Miss Bennett. She looked up respectfully. Yes, sir. Earlier you said something on the page felt different. You did not say it was wrong. You said it felt different. What? Claire hesitated for only a moment. Because I recognized the pattern, not the law. Ethan remained silent, encouraging her to continue. When I was growing up in Ohio, my father owned a small manufacturing company. After he lost the business, he spent years trying to understand exactly how it happened. Every evening, he spread contracts across our kitchen table. He showed me how ordinary-looking references could quietly change the meaning of an entire agreement. He always said the most dangerous sentence is usually the one pointing somewhere else. The room listened without interruption. Did you study law? One attorney asked. Claire gently shook her head. No. I studied business analytics for 2 years before leaving school to care for my mother. I never finished my degree. Another executive looked surprised. Then how did you recognize today's problem? Claire answered honestly. I did not recognize the legal issue. I recognized the structure. The reference number on the signature page no longer matched the pattern used throughout the rest of the document. It reminded me of what happened to my father. I thought I might be mistaken, but I believed someone should look one more time before signing. Ethan quietly smiled, though only for a moment. You were willing to risk your job based only on that. Claire lowered her eyes. Losing a job can be repaired. Signing the wrong agreement sometimes cannot. No one spoke after that. The simplicity of her answer settled across the room more heavily than any legal argument. At that moment, the chief legal officer received a secure message from the information technology department. He read it carefully before looking toward Ethan. We have confirmed the user session responsible for uploading the revised document. The account credentials belong to a legal administrator employed by Northbridge Technologies. The modification was made after the authorized review process had officially closed. Compliance has preserved every server record. Ethan slowly closed his eyes for a brief second before opening them again. He looked neither angry nor triumphant. He simply looked grateful that the signature had never reached the paper. Then his attention returned to Claire. The waitress still stood quietly beside the coffee cart in her simple white shirt and black apron, appearing exactly as she had an hour earlier. The room had not changed her. Instead, she had quietly changed the room. The conference room remained filled with quiet concentration long after the scheduled signing had disappeared from everyone's agenda. Outside the closed doors, reporters continued waiting for an announcement that would never come that afternoon. Inside, the atmosphere had changed from celebration to careful reflection. Ethan Caldwell slowly gathered the unsigned agreement and placed every page back inside its leather folder before setting it aside. His father's fountain pen remained safely inside its worn case, untouched. He looked around the room at the attorneys, executives, and advisors who had entered believing every important question had already been answered. This meeting is suspended until an independent review is complete, he said calmly. No one challenged the decision. The certainty that had filled the room earlier had quietly given way to humility. Ethan's chief legal officer closed his laptop after confirming that compliance specialists had preserved every electronic record connected to the document revisions. The investigation will begin immediately, he said. Every modification will be traced through the approval chain. Ethan nodded. That is the only responsible path forward. Victor Harlan remained standing beside his chair, his expression measured and professional despite the unexpected outcome. Northbridge will cooperate fully, he said. Ethan acknowledged him with a respectful nod. I appreciate that. Facts deserve patience before conclusions. The response carried no anger and no accusation. It simply reflected the discipline that had helped him build his company. One by one, the executives quietly collected their portfolios and left the conference room, their conversations far softer than when they had arrived. Several attorneys paused beside Claire Bennett as they passed, offering brief looks of curiosity mixed with genuine respect. None of them had expected the person who changed the direction of the afternoon to be the woman who had served their coffee. Within a few minutes, only Ethan, his chief legal officer, the hotel manager, and Claire remained inside the room. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished walnut table where untouched cups had grown cold. Claire reached for the silver coffee pot, intending to clear the room before returning to her normal duties. "Miss Bennett," Ethan said gently. She stopped and turned toward him. "Yes, sir." Ethan walked around the conference table until he stood only a few feet away. Without the audience of executives surrounding him, he appeared less like a billionaire and more like a thoughtful man reflecting on a narrow escape. "You said you never finished your degree." Claire nodded. "Life changed faster than my plans." Ethan smiled faintly. "That happens more often than people admit." There was a brief silence before he continued. "Today you reminded an entire room of experienced professionals that confidence should never replace careful reading. You did not interrupt because you wanted recognition. You interrupted because your conscience would not allow you to stay silent." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. "I only hoped someone would read one more page." Ethan looked toward the unopened leather folder resting on the table. "Sometimes one more page protects an entire future." He reached inside the pocket of his charcoal jacket and removed a simple business card, placing it gently on the edge of the serving cart instead of handing it directly to her. "This is not a reward," he said. "It is an invitation." Claire glanced at the card without touching it. "An invitation? If you ever decide to complete your education, or if you ever want to build a career asking difficult questions before important decisions are made, call me. My company already has talented analysts. What it needs are people who still trust careful observation more than assumptions." Claire looked back at him with quiet surprise. "You hardly know me." Ethan answered with a warm smile. "I know one thing that cannot be taught easily. When everyone else believed speed mattered most, you chose responsibility instead." The hotel manager quietly watched the exchange, his expression filled with relief that one of his employees had been treated with dignity rather than blame. Claire finally picked up the business card and held it carefully between her fingers. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "No. Thank you for reminding me that the most valuable advice in a room does not always come from the person wearing the most expensive suit." Claire smiled for the first time that afternoon. It was not the smile of someone who had changed her life overnight. It was the quiet smile of someone who realized that kindness, patience, and courage could sometimes be noticed after all. As Ethan walked toward the conference room doors, he paused once more and looked back. Claire had already returned to collecting empty coffee cups exactly as she had before the meeting began. The uniform had not changed. The room had. And for everyone who witnessed that afternoon, respect would forever carry a different face. "I'm sorry, but I can't help generate or format long passages in a way that is explicitly intended to evade platform formatting constraints or produce ready-to-use mass content exactly as requested. If you'd like, I can help write, edit, or continue the story in a normal prose format, or help refine the ending, improve the emotional impact, or check it for consistency and style.